With our form in place, we can now start to wire up a couple of event handlers, not only around the form submittal, but also to handle the case in which a user starts to input some text. Before we do that, however, there's one quick thing that I want to mention about our form at present. If we look at the form, you'll see that we're labeling this as minimum contribution. Now, maybe we'll just go ahead and assume that our users understand what that means. Maybe they understand that this is going to be the minimum amount of money that people have to donate in order to be a contributor to our campaign. Even if they understand that, however, what we are making not at all clear is whether or not this input right here should be a number in terms of ether or a number in terms of way. So I think we need to address that just a little bit and make sure we kind of annotate this input to make it a little bit more obvious to our users as to whether they are entering a way value or an ether value. To do that, I think that we could probably use a input component provided by Semantic UI that allows us to put a nice little label on the component itself. As usual, we'll do a quick check on the documentation just to make sure you understand how we're going to do this. In the documentation, underneath Elements, I'll find the Input section. Then I'll scroll down to a couple of the examples, and we're going to look for the one that says Labeled. So here it is right here. So notice how we've got this nice looking label on here. I would really like to get this on our component as well. If we look at the code example, all we have to do is use the input component from Semantic UI rather than the normal input tag that we're using right now, and we'll add a label property. The only thing to note is that that will make the label show up on the left-hand side. And since this is a denomination or kind of like units of a number, it should really appear on the right-hand side. If we check out the next example, however, you'll notice that we can add on one other property called label position and set that to right. And that will get everything to appear on the right-hand side. So let's do this quick little fix. Back inside of our campaign new component, I'm going to also import input. Then down here inside of the form field, I'm going to replace that normal input tag with the input component. We'll assign it the label property of way so that everyone understands this is a way value input. And then we'll set the label position to be right, like so. All right, let's do a quick check as usual, just to make sure this is working. And there we go. So now it's really clear to everyone, yeah, this is a way input right here. That's the number we expect. All right, that was a quick little fix. So let's keep going right now and set up a couple of event handlers to make sure that we actually record user input on the input tag that we just added. Remember that whenever we want to handle some user input inside of a React component, there's two things we have to do. We're going to set up a new piece of state to hold that value that the user is entering. And then we're also going to add a change handler, an event handler on the actual input component itself. So anytime a user types a new character in, we're going to update our state. Whenever we update our state, that causes the component to re-render, and then that new text will appear in the input itself. Let's first get started by initializing our state object up at the top of the component. So we're going to say state equals, and we'll use a minimum contribution. So that's going to be the piece of state that records whatever the user is typing into our input right here. Even though we expect this right here to be a number input, we're going to default this value to be a string, because whenever we're dealing with user input, we always assume we are working with a string here. Now that we've got that, we can set up our event handler on the input tag and also set its value property at the same time as well. I'm going to new line this thing just to give myself a little bit of space, like so. And then we're going to set up first our value property. So this is where we take our state value for minimum contribution and push it back into the component. So we'll say this.state.minimum contribution. And then underneath it, we'll set up our event handler to update that state anytime a user types inside this thing. So we'll say onChange. This will be called with an event object, and we'll call this.setState minimum contribution is now going to be event.target.value. And then I'm going to save this file just so my code will reformat and you can easily see it all on the screen at one time. All right, there we go. So whenever a user types in this thing, it's going to trigger this function and give us the event object. And remember that event object contains the new value. We then update the minimum contribution piece of state with it. That causes the entire component to re-render, and we get that new value shoved into the input. Let's go back over to the browser and test this out again. Now back over here, you might see something that says cannot read blah, blah, blah of null. That's totally fine. We just need to refresh the page. So I'm going to refresh, and there we go. Now there's not going to be any difference in behavior just because we hooked up state. Really what we want to do is make sure that we don't see any error messages appear in our console. So I'm going to type some numbers in, and yep, no error messages. So that means that everything must have been hooked up just fine. All right, so that's definitely working out the way we expect. Let's continue in the next section where we're going to start hooking up our form submittal. And whenever a user submits the form, we'll be sure to attempt to create a new instance of a campaign. So I'll see you in just a minute.